lot of people coming in saying, I want kind of like 5 cute ways to reframe the way I think about my life and make me happy and make me kind of better and fix all of this. And it's like, well, that doesn't work. If we had that magic wand, you'd already have it.
Right.
It's like the only way into navigating life meaningfully is to connect to the parts of yourself that have a deeper orientation for who you are. And if you can feed yourself from that place, so much becomes available in who we are, what we can pull on in ourselves, how we move in life, what impassions us, what even we think we can become. And it just feels to me like without that depth approach, we're starved. And I think we see that enormously in our culture right now.
Hello, beautiful people. On today's podcast, we have the gorgeous Dr. Joanna LaPrade. Joanna is a Jungian psychologist who has a Ph.D. in Jungian and archetypal psychology and is currently a practising psychotherapist. She's the author of the book Forged in Darkness, The Many Paths of Personal Transformation. What I personally love about this conversation is Joanna's depth. And it is no surprise as she specializes in depth psychology, which she explains in this episode. I always love the expansiveness of conversations like this, where the themes and traits that we usually suppress actually become the main points of focus. Why I love this so much is because not only does it avail the opportunity for you to see yourself and accept yourself in all of who you are, the light and the so-called darkness, but it also touches on the fundamentals of getting to the core problem and not simply treating the symptom. Time and time again, especially in becoming a mindset coach, I see so often people keeping in the safety of the surface, rather than exploring the long-term healing components of depth. Certainly, a topic we touch on in this episode is we explore the power of self-awareness over strategy and how the commercialization of self-help has become a burden to the underworld of our psychology that is at the forefront of our current behavior and what we just may like to change. So where I would love to start is with your absolutely beautiful book, Forged in Darkness. I've never really been drawn to the surface of things. I've always pried, dug, and explored the deeper and darker layers. The thread that connects my curiosities and passions is my fascination with the inner world, particularly those places within us that are painful, confusing, yet intriguing. Places I have come to see as my own underworld. Above all, I'm enlivened by stories of people's lives and histories, of the human imagination and the myths we tell to explain ourselves and our place in the world. I became a depth psychologist because I wanted to engage with myself and others in complex, creative, and meaningful ways, to look beneath the surface and see and feel what is actually going on in the psyche. So, Joanna, where I would love to start is for you to share more about what is depth psychology, and in particular, what is your own personal relationship to it?
It's a good question. In a simple but non-simple way, I would say depth psychology is the study of the unconscious. So psychology is a big tent. The study of the human mind is a big tent. And the disciplines, I would say depth or analytical, those terms are interchangeable, are concerned with, let's imagine psychology as a table. And we have a lot of psychologies that are concerned about orienting with what we know in ourselves already. We're kind of fiddling with the placemats and fiddling with the forks and do we need a different setting? Right. And a depth psychology or a study of the unconscious is trying to reach underneath the table. It's trying to bring out something in yourself that you're not accessible to or have easy access to, whether that's parts of yourself you've repressed because of your life or society or cultural norms, or even just parts of your personhood that haven't matured yet or been accessible as, we all kind of grow into more parts of ourselves. And I think most people have a pretty intuitive sense of what the unconscious is. outside of it being a really hard term to wrap our heads around, because in its essence, it's not really a knowable part, but we all can feel that, right? Moments when we do things and we're like, oh, I don't know if that was really me, or somebody upsets us and we're like enraged, and it doesn't feel like that anger really is rooted in what's going on. Or I think most interestingly, the kind of mystery within us that kind of knows the answer to who we are, but I don't really know how to explain that. I think a lot of people have called that many things throughout life: soul, spirit, God, this sense of kind of what are we all about, and at a really deep and hard to access way. And so, I think the study of the unconscious is attuning ourselves to that deeper source of wisdom, of understanding, of direction, both in kind of a larger sense of our own personality, but also kind of turning to the parts of ourselves that we don't really want to look at, so aren't a part of the kind of light of our awareness. And I think for me, why I've been interested in that, I don't know if I know how to answer that question. It's so complex for me, but I think it kind of boils down to feeling like nothing else works, if that makes sense. It's like you can't live on the surface of things. Like I struggle with this as a therapist a lot, of people coming in saying, I want kind of like 5 cute ways to reframe the way I think about my life and make me happy and make me kind of better and fix all of this. And it's like, well, that doesn't work. If we had that magic wand, you'd already have it.
Right.
It's like the only way into navigating life meaningfully is to connect to the parts of yourself that have a deeper orientation for who you are. And if you can feed yourself from that place, so much becomes available in who we are, what we can pull on in ourselves, how we move in life, what impassions us, what even we think we can become. And it just feels to me like without that depth approach, we're starved. And I think we see that enormously in our culture right now.
Well, I'm just curious, because this really makes me think of kind of like addressing symptoms versus treating the core problem. Why do you think that we have a tendency to sort of stay more on that surface level that you talk about than to really go deep and honestly, like really try and actually help and heal ourselves?
I mean, I think that in some ways is the great question of the modern era, and it's so multifaceted, but, we have been, and I don't really fully understand the complexity of it, but I think, for whatever reason, we've become to treat ourselves like these kind of mechanical issues that can be fixed. And we have, I think an important question to look at our culture and ourselves is like, maybe we're becoming increasingly less religious, but what do you worship in life? Right? What do we as moderns worship? And we worship order, we worship happiness, we worship the kind of image of the material, image of perfection. And so what is required for us to serve our God? And in order to do that, right, we live under this enormous pressure not to suffer, not to be in the unkempt, not to be in the messy things that we can't control. We've taken life and divided it into little chunks and said, I'll stay in this container and we can fix it and make ourselves feel better quickly, easily. Here's your solution. Here's your pill. And in order to live in that world, we have to repress all the kind of Dianism of the inner world that is full of darkness, that is full of confusion, is full of pain, is full of, these things that take time and have complex solutions. And we just want this clean line. Like I see this a lot in my work. I feel like people imagine growth and change like a ladder. And it's like, I'll just climb up this ladder and get there quicker and faster. And every time I take a step down, it's this epic failure of my own development. And it's like, no, growth is like this. It's a spiral.
Right.
It's not a ladder. And I think we've become really concerned with maintaining that surface area because that is what's good. That is what's right. That is what is in the image of kind of the Judeo-Christian mythos that tells us, you know, we have to be happy. And, you know, which is like a whole nother conversation. I go off course here and talk about happiness. But, you know, I think we've really just become to really worship those qualities and really seen them as anything other than that is failure. I mean, our social media feeds it. The way we talk about things in our culture feeds it. Our medicine feeds it. This whole sense of kind of, we can fix the problem and make you better.
Yeah, I want to explore this more with you because I have heard you say that there's almost like a burden of positivity. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that?
I think we live under this mandate, right? That's like to be happy. We ask ourselves that. Are we happy in our partnership? Are we happy in our job? Are we, you know, are we happy with our bodies? Are we happy with our hair? Are we happy with our friendships? And it's this enormous pressure that I think people feel to judge life by happiness, which is a really new idea in the human world. I mean, we typically, I mean, human arc is most religious sensibilities believe that, you know, this life is hard and it has a lot of toil and suffering in it. And if you live accordance to X, Y, and Z, then you can be happy in the afterlife, that this life itself is not for happiness. But I think we've taken that spirit and that sacred out of the divine, and we've put it in our material world. And so we ask ourselves, do these shoes make me happy? You know, does my car make me happy? And we don't ask ourselves, am I living meaningfully? You know, and I always feel like happiness is an outcome. It's a conglomeration of what you're doing that's in alignment with a greater sense in yourself. Like I work as a therapist, like I spend all day in people's thick, messy suffering. It's not enjoyable. It's not like, but it makes me happy.
Right.
It's in alignment with what is meaningful for me. You know, parents these days will ask you, like, what do you want? What do you want for your child? I want my child to be happy. They don't say, I want my child to challenge themselves and live a meaningful life and find out, you know, who they truly are. I want them to be in ease and comfort. I want them to be in the day world. And we measure and weigh our lives by that. And I think it's our culture. I think it's the messaging on social media. It's the disconnection from that, just the opportunity that we have now to put the doctored perfect world online and people see that. Yeah. You know, we have so many avenues to feed that image of happiness. And I think people feel really obligated to be there. So then they think, you know, how do I get better quickly? You know, like right now in the therapeutic world, the DSM-5, the like diagnostic book is creating a new diagnosis around kind of like prolonged grief disorder, basically, meaning like, AKA you're grieving too long. Interesting. Like, what does that mean? You're grieving too long? It's like, now that's an ailment. Like you haven't been happy. You haven't gotten back to happiness quick enough.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think the consequences of that are that we're repressing our darkness and we're repressing our way into, you know, this, which is a lot of what my book is about, this enormous cauldron that we have in ourselves that of course sucks to be in. No one wants to be unhappy. No one wants to suffer any of that. But tell me somebody who hasn't undergone an enormous transformation in themselves and a deepening in themselves that didn't happen in that place.
Yeah.
Like I want to meet them. I've yet to, and I'm open to it 100%. I just haven't.
And this sort of suppression of darkness, to my understanding, is kind of like made up of this, your word, this underworld. What is in this underworld that we all do have?
You know, in my book, I kind of talk about that in a two-facet way. I would say in one way, the underworld is a wonderful symbol for the deep, dark, terrifying places that we all experience in our life, the place where the lights go out, right? Whether that's our shame or our insecurity, or we lose someone we love, or we experience trauma or violence, just the place in which we can't orient ourselves in the old ways, the familiar ways kind of navigating life no longer holds capacity. And, so I think we all experience that to greater or lesser degrees, whether we get fired or we get broken up with, or, we experience larger traumas, war, violence, shootings, rape, these terrible things that are in our life that pull us into enormous discomfort. And then I would also put the underworld as a symbol or a metaphor of kind of the deep places within the inner world, the unconscious psyche, right? It's probably not accurate to do this, but for our own imaging, right, we can imagine consciousness on the surface, and underneath that, right, is this kind of wellspring of things that are unattainable, are places that are hard to go into in ourselves. And that ranges for everybody. Some of them are probably really akin. We all have our self-doubt. We all have our shame in our different ways. We all have the parts of our shadows we don't want to acknowledge that we have in ourselves. Right. And for each of us, it's different. And for some of us, it's the same, on some level. But I think that the idea that the kind of orientation of the deep psyche's direction is downward.
And can you share more about, you just mentioned the shadow sort of being part of this underworld. I think this is a really important one to kind of focus on. Can you share more about what our shadow is and how it tends to show up in our life?
So I think, the shadow is a Jungian term for when, the creation of personality will always create shadow, in the sense that, to live in society, to live in relationship, we almost imagine that you come into the world fully whole, whatever that means, right? And we have to repress certain parts of ourselves. Maybe we repress the part of ourselves that wants to wail and scream every time we say no, we're told no. And so we learn more control. So we repress the part of us that just can't control anything and wants to scream like a little, I don't know, baby tiger or something. We repress to fit in. We repress to kind of mold to our community. And we repress different things depending on what we are told fits in. If a child sings in the kitchen over and over and their parents tell them, you have a terrible voice, stop singing, they'll repress their creative energy to sing over time, right? If we're told we're not smart, we might repress our intelligence. People take the best parts of themselves just as quickly as they take kind of the unrefined parts of themselves. And all of this energy, which I think for a lot of us has generalizations, right? To live in society, we repress the kind of more angry, violent parts of ourselves, or we repress the parts of ourselves that, others might not enjoy or might not feel like it fits in. And then we all have unique things, right? That comes from our own experience in life. And all of that gets funneled into what Jung called the shadow, which was kind of this warehouse of everything that the ego ideal, so our conscious sense of self, didn't believe that it could be, didn't think was imaged in the right way. So for example, in a dream space, right, the shadow typically comes as really unkempt figures, or things that are dark or disheveled or broken down or untended, right? It's all of this material that we feel doesn't belong in who we are. And so the shadow, because of that repression, is an enormously powerful thing. It always wants life. It wants back in so that original wholeness can kind of be reformed. And so working on your shadow is a really interesting thing, because it's a good measure for that is kind of what drives you absolutely bonkers crazy in somebody. like make you want to tear your arm off so that you have something to throw at them. It's like when you see someone like that, the shadow always turns up in projected form. So we see it outside of our self first. And either we are enormously drawn to it because it's the part of ourselves we're trying to access, or we're enormously or we're enormously repulsed by it because we don't want to acknowledge that part of ourselves. So say you see somebody who's like really, really wealthy and you want that wealth. So maybe you hate that person, right? Because you're envious of really wanting whatever that wealth means to you. But really what you dislike in them is a longing in yourself, right? Shadow work is the recognition that everything you dislike in another is ultimately about yourself and how you digest that in your own relationship to your image of who you are. And I think shadow is so important to be conscious of and to work on, because if we can handle what is uncomfortable in us that we don't want to acknowledge, we prevent this projection that we do that causes so much relief, right? If I'm uncomfortable, but it's your fault because you're the carrier of that energy, then I can hate you and it doesn't have anything to do with me. And then I get all this relief, right? It's not me, it's those people, it's those idiots that think that way, rather than, wow, I'm also afraid of that. And instead of acknowledging my own fear, I'm removing that discomfort by putting it on somebody else. So I think in this day and age, I mean, shadow work, I don't know if it gets more important than that.
Yeah. And this kind of plays into my understanding, sort of this individuation process. Can you share more about what that is, and I guess sort of how that ties in with the line of work that you do with your clients?
So the effort of Carl Jung's psychology, so I'm a Jungian psychologist, so the effort in his psychology is what he calls individuation, which is basically becoming your authentic or whole self. And Jung is very clear that that's not an end goal. Like he says somewhere along the line, like, I've never met an individuated person. It's not an ED period finished process, but the journey. And in the Jungian understanding of the psyche, the orientation in the psyche is that the psyche has telos, which telos or teleology means the direction of a final purpose, almost like destiny. So an acorn has telos, right? It will become an oak tree. It's not going to become a giraffe. It has an in-baked sense of manifestation. And Jung argues, so does our sense of self. And the work of a life, the privilege of a life, is to try to access who that really is. And almost, I think the way that I imagine it in myself is, like, imagine whatever that kind of fullness of who you are is at the end of a road, and you're at the beginning of the road, and the goal is to get to that place. But so much in life puts sticks and stones and crevices and rocks and gorges and all these obstacles in between us and who that is. And the work of individuation is clearing that path, getting yourself to be able to attune to the voice of who are you really on a deep level. What makes you passionate? What makes you alive? What gives you life energy? What is being asked of you to kind of manifest who you are? What is meaningful for you? Like, these are the questions of individuation. And in order to access that, you've got to, it's like, how do I want to go about saying this? It's like, it's that conscious orientation in us that is designed to keep us stable in one form, right? The ego, or the conscious sense of self, is a pattern maker. It repeats identity so that we get the privilege of saying, I am this, I think this, I feel this. But because of that task of continuity, the ego gets narrow. It hates change. It hates nuance. It hates, the emergence of other things. And so individuation is the journey in which that self, that ego in us, turns towards something larger in us and can begin to relate to it, can begin to see that there's something else in the psyche besides, that surface level of who we are.
Yeah. And how does self-awareness play into this? Because kind of going full circle back to where we started, we're sort of in this day and age of self-help, and it's sort of like the 5 practical takeaways and steps and strategies. How does sort of self-awareness in your eyes become more important than that?
Well, I mean, it's a beautiful question, and I think one of the things I've kind of been saying about this book is that it's a self-awareness book, not a self-help book. And I think one of the things that becomes so important is individually attuning to yourself. How do you move? What are your patterns? What are your fears? What inspires you? Where does your energy pool? Where do your values? Asking yourself these questions about who you are. And, I think a large effort in my book is this exploration of other ways that we can navigate what is hard for us, except outside of this, I think, kind of societal expectation that we do it strongly, courageously, boldly, we willfully do it, and we kind of, beat all the monsters of the world into submission. And I think self-awareness is about, how do I uniquely orient to something?
Nice.
Is my way into myself through dance, through dreams, through talking, through silence, through my body? Maybe it's 2 or 3 of those. Maybe it's a bunch of them. It's about finding the uniqueness in your own self to then help you navigate what you can't escape in life. So much in life can't go around above. It has to go through it. And I think that's one of the problems of the modern kind of self-help model is it's a one-size-shoe-fits-all situation. Yeah. And it doesn't. Some people are quick, some people are slow, some people jump to meaning, and then they realize, oh no, I've gone too far and everything's gilded and I forgot to suffer. And then they come back 2 years later. And then, it's like we all have a unique way. And I think self-help is about a program, and self-awareness is about curiosity in who you are.
And why do you think, and this is obviously just a personal question to you, why do you think that, or why have we lost that sense of importance about our own way of orienteering?
Yeah, I know. I think there's so many factors. I mean, I think there's been a real commercialization of ourselves, and that we've turned ourselves, maybe that's a better way to say what I said earlier around kind of a mechanical issue, is that it's like we've turned ourselves into a product.
Right.
I feel like the modern goal is like to shoot out of a cannon as fast as you can and run across that race, collecting as much toys as you can to get to the finish line as fast as you can. And, what we're talking about in turning into the unconscious and turning into that part of our being is not about doing production. We don't get trophies of selfhood for how much money we've made or how far we've run or how much of, X, Y, and Z we've collected. It's quiet, it's still, it's unmeasurable, and I don't think people know ways into that anymore. And we're, the soul in this deeper work is slow.
Yeah.
And it's hard and it's messy and it doesn't pop us out quickly, shiny and new. And I think we're really impatient with those things. And so we say, can I have a simple way to get fixed and get better? And nobody wants to slow down enough to attune themselves to these much harder questions in life and much more uncomfortable questions.
And I'd love for you to share sort of your distinction between pain and suffering, because I've sort of seen you write that pain can give us purpose, depth, and quality of soul, which I think is really beautiful. But I really think that kind of plays also into distinguishing it from this sense of suffering.
I think I write about this somewhere in the book. There's a wonderful, very, very famous grief therapist, David Kessler, makes this distinction. And he argues that pain is a process. It's an outcome of life. It's inevitable. When you lose somebody, you're going to feel pain. And if you don't feel pain, I would, as a therapist, be more concerned about that, right, than
Right.
anything else. And that suffering is a choice. That suffering is this thicker process. And I would almost, I would say it's almost a degree of intensity, pain and suffering. I think pain is more instinctive. Suffering is, I feel like to suffer, you have to bring the mind on board, right? And at the same time, I think there's utility in both, right? Like a lot comes from suffering. There's a lot of connection in suffering. There's a wonderful Buddhist parable called the golden mustard seed, where this woman goes to the Buddha and asks him, to revive her child who had recently passed. And he said, of course, but first you must go to the village and you must ask everybody if they have suffered. And if you can find no one that has suffered, ask them for a golden mustard seed, and you bring the seed back and I will, revive your child. And so of course this woman, right, she comes back to the Buddha and empty-handed, because she couldn't find anyone that had never suffered. Pain, I feel like, is unique. It's alive. It's immediate for us. Suffering is a human condition. It's a part of life. And is it a choice sometimes? Sure. But it's a prolongedness to suffering, right? There's a relationship, there's an engagement to that we have to choose what to do with.
Right. And I'd love to know how sort of self-love and self-nurturance plays into this, because to my understanding, you kind of have this idea that people tend to fear self-focus, which I think is really interesting.
In our world, I think we feel, maybe this, I'm just kind of shooting from my own observations, but maybe I think self-love, self-focus, I think it's actually very shadowy for us, right? In the sense that I think in general, we're enormously narcissistic as a culture. It is one of our guards for sure. And I think for people, it dominates so much of who we are that we don't actually want to look at that. So when it comes to actual self-preservation, actual self-focus, actual self-turning in, it's like we're allergic to it, because I think we don't really want to acknowledge that we live in an enormously individualistic society that is full of self-focus. Most people live from that place. We live in an age of individualism. That's hyper individualism. Like, that's our message. We don't live in relationship to our communities in the same way, in relationship to the sacred in the same way. We pillage, we take, we are developing ourselves. And so I think that idea for a lot of people is really uncomfortable, because it's what we're doing, right? That's how the shadow works.
Yeah. And you have a brother that experienced a traumatic brain injury. How has sort of everything that we've so far covered in this conversation helped you to move through that?
Well, to be honest, which I make clear in the book and in the beginning of the book, that, this book comes from that experience in myself, and it comes from my encounter with not having this perspective, really.
Right.
And, I think when my brother had his accident, like, I stepped in full hero mode, I was gonna, with the sheer will of my own being, like, stand in between him and death. And that was what was going to happen. And, take care of my parents, take care of my sister, and just willfully prevent anything that I didn't want to control out of, just like pushing it out of the room, right, with my own willful energy. And so many people during the journey would say things like to me about, he's a hero, or be a hero. And he's a good person, he'll live. And it just started turning these questions in me around, well, of course my brother's a wonderful being and person. That doesn't mean he's going to survive this. And seeing this kind of limitation that I really started experiencing in myself of not being able to let myself feel what was happening, because I was so determined to not be affected by it and to kind of willfully go through life. And so I think, to kind of back into your question, I think I didn't have these perspectives. Like, I had a close family, and I had, all of that love to kind of be there for what was going on, but I wasn't really there for what was going on. And I think it was after, my brother's recovery and when I started my doctoral work that these ideas really started to percolate in me. And this question around kind of heroism and what is that? And why are we told to be that? And, are there other ways to be a hero that don't involve kind of willfully picking up a sword and like defending yourself from being affected by life? And I think, to be really honest, this book comes from my own weakness in it, is that I've had to write this book because this has been my task in my own inner journey, to work on these things, to be comfortable with the dark things, to face, those moments of fear in myself and what makes me uncomfortable in myself, or the death of the people that I love. And, realizing that this rhetoric that we have around getting better, controlling it, fixing it, it's limiting our possibilities, and it's limiting, our own, our own ability to learn from these places. Like, what if we thought that the deep and dark places in life were valuable, transformative, and could be approached in more ways than we're told they could be? What would become available to us? And I think that's really the question in myself that seeded this book. And then, I started reading all this beautiful Greek mythology and seeing all these other heroes and all these other gods and goddesses that journey into this dark place, but they do it in really different ways. And got really curious about, well, what if we were exploring these other ways? And then I think as my career kind of started, so to speak, and I started my private practice, and then I saw this dynamic just walking in and out of my clinical room, and people, back in the place that I remembered being in, were feeling like the only option that they had was just to be heroically strong and just be the Terminator in that doorway. And realizing so many people were struggling with what I was struggling with, which was like, I can't hold this.
Right.
And it's not helping me face what I need to face here. And so, I think I wrote this book because it feels true to me, that people need a way into these things, because what came out of my brother's journey, for him, for my family, for myself, was a depth of personhood and capacity that none of us had access to before that happened. And if we hadn't paid attention to it, would we have just almost like that treasure rise up and then just sink back down?
Right. And on this path to sort of individuation, or like wholeness and authenticity that we're all on for our lives, where is sort of an entrance into this? If we were to sort of get off this conversation and really start being more present to these things that we're normally suppressing or repressing, do we start with sort of a question? Like, what is a sort of like beginner level way of sort of opening up to this underworld that you speak about?
It's I love that question. And I would say that the very first thing is that it's about your attitude. right? You have to believe that these things are important,
Right.
that there's something there for you in it. There's no technique into that attitude. It's, try to think of moments in your life where you were really uncomfortable or really afraid, or, a part of yourself that you would never tell anybody about because it's so terrible, or when you're the most critical on yourself, right? And if you hold those experiences and you think like, this is bad that I feel this way, you'll never get curious. You'll never have enough wherewithal to stand in that place and ask your anxiety what it's trying to tell you, or why are you so anxious in life? This is a really uncomfortable feeling, but what's out of alignment? Is it telling me that I'm not feeling something that I need to feel? Or, every time I go to work, I get so anxious. Okay, that's information about how your soul is responding to what you're doing.
Right.
But if you don't believe that that's a message or that's meaningful, you're never going to slow down enough to notice it. So it starts with that attitude, right? It starts with that valuing. And I talk about this in my book of this really foreign phenomenon in human history of not having an active relationship with the underworld. Our very first archaeological evidence of what us little humans were up to was that we were burying things. We were worshiping the darkness because we've always been afraid of it. And so we've had a really long relationship of these spaces within life being something that we don't want to go into naturally,
right.
Of course. And we also have a really, really long relationship of reverence towards them, knowing that there's something really powerful in those places. In Greek mythology, Hades in Greek, who becomes Pluto, in the Roman verbiage, Pluto comes from Plutos, which means bringer of wealth or riches. We've always had a relationship that there has been something really, really valuable in the deep places. And so I think it's ultimately about that attitude. In my book, I call it an underworld perspective, but feeling like, okay, this is uncomfortable. Maybe I don't even want to go into it right now. It's too scary. It's too overwhelming. But I wonder if there might be something there of value for me at some point. If you can cultivate that attitude, then you can begin the work of trying to find your way into that. Nice. What am I afraid of? Why? Where does that fear come from? Is it telling me something? What about this feels like, I have all that anxiety because there's no life energy for me at work. Okay, so where did your life energy go? Why is it pulling in a different direction? What is your pattern in life? Do you get into the same type of relationship that makes you feel the same way over and over again? Right? Then you can start asking yourself these self-reflective, self-awareness questions. But if the attitude is rush it, fix it, bottle it up, and get better, you're not keeping the lid on the bottle enough for anything to affect you.
Right. Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for this wonderful conversation. There's so much beautiful wisdom in this. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
So on a final note, I would love to ask you, what does it mean to you to be human?
I think, I joke about this with my clients a lot. Obviously, I'm a myth buff. But the Greek pantheon, all the gods in the Greek pantheon kind of pop into existence. There's two exceptions to this. Eros is a baby his whole life, and Hermes is born, but immediately is full functioning human, despite his, being born for 30 seconds. But the gods kind of pop into existence. They are. And they are not flawed. They are, despite them being so flawed and so fickle. I don't know if any of your listeners is into myth, but the gods are batshit crazy. And, but they just are. And I think to be human is to know that you are not, if that makes sense, that you have to undergo the journey of becoming who you are. You did not pop into existence. We don't get that privilege. You know, we don't come preformed. And so can the humanness in it, you know, be tolerated in us? Can we tolerate that imperfection, that messiness, that becomingness in ourselves? And if we can, I think we get to have the human journey. You know, in mythology, the difference between the gods and the heroes are that the heroes, although they typically have a divine flavor to them in some capacity, they have to struggle and grow and suffer and make mistakes and die and be reborn and go through the journey. Life is for living. And that's, I think, what it means to be human, for better or for worse. And I wonder what humanity would look like if we were okay with that.